First, I want to start out with asking you guys a question, and you probably discussed this some on the side, and you can probably put this in the chat and I'll look at it later. But I wonder, what do you think that policy is? Like, when I say the word policy, what comes to mind? I'm going to guess probably a lot of Congress, images of paper, things written down, maybe rules, regulations. I tend to think of policy a little bit more very fluidly. The way that I got into policy, I was a soil student at the University of Tennessee, and I had these big plans to go out and make the world a better place through good, healthy soil practices and improving the environment. And after I graduated, I went to live in Uzbekistan for a couple of years as sort of a Peace Corps-ish type thing. And in Uzbekistan, agriculture is really big and their policies have had a huge impact on the landscape in Uzbekistan. Go and look up the Aral Sea sometime if you don't know that situation. But I'd been living in Uzbekistan for about a year and a half. I spoke the language and was getting to know students there. And I worked mostly at the Irrigation Institute there, the way they divide out colleges. The agricultural school was called the Irrigation Institute. And I was visiting a visiting lecture from an American professor who came, and he was speaking in English, and most of the people in the room spoke English, and then they had a translator. And he was talking about natural resources policy in the U.S. and about restoring salmon populations. And I had been in the culture long enough to know kind of what he said that would translate and what did not translate and just wouldn't make sense in the Uzbek culture. And I kind of had a light come on in my head after that presentation, that knowing what the science says that alone isn't going to necessarily have the effect that you need to have to solve environmental problems, which is that's why I'm into soil health, is I like to solve those big environmental issue problems. That you also have to know people, and you have to know people includes all the institutions that people are a part of. It includes cultural values. It includes how people eat, where people go, how they get from place to place, what their families look like. And to me, policy is creating these big overarching solutions or ideas that apply to people in their real lives. Or that's what policy should be at its finest. And it's a little bit art, and it's a lot politics, and it should be informed by the best science. But it doesn't always work out that way. So now that you've done some deep thinking and maybe written down some ideas in the chat of what you think policy is, let's start out with where soil policy started in the United States. And I promise I'm not going to do a big history lecture here. I totally could, because soil policy has changed so much based on the big events in U.S. history, but kind of where soil policy started was the Dust Bowl. And prior to that, there was an absence of policy to govern soil health. There was an absence of intention to look after the soil as a resource. Instead, there was a combination of things that led to the Dust Bowl. One was a good market for crops, and harnessed speculation from investors, so private sector involvement, and then also federal encouragement of people to go out and plow up the land. So prior to that Dust Bowl, that's what you had. And then after the Dust Bowl happened, Congress realized that they had to create a solution. And that's when the Soil Conservation Service started. That's today the Natural Resource Conservation Service out of USDA. And it started with some basic policies that some of them we still use today, planting native prairie, converting land into grassland, having some land that's retired. These are like the foundation for the same kind of policies that we have now that have an impact on soil health. If you haven't seen the Ken Burns film about the Dust Bowl. It's really good. So definitely recommend it. But I'm going to fast forward. I had these ideas of kind of jumping back and forth. I've got some articles on here that I recommend you look at. The Great Depression and the Dust Bowl happened. Then there was World War II. There was the manufacture of weapons resulted in after that happened, the manufacture of that turned into fertilizer. So the massive widespread use of fertilizers and different chemicals that happened after World War II. So you have these massive events throughout history that are kind of slowly having this massive impact on what agriculture is and what soil is today. And there's some just different articles there. Earl Butz in the 1970s was the big get big or get big out USDA leader under Nixon. He had an impact on policy. Then there was the 1980s farm crisis. And then over the years, there have been a series of farm bills, which is probably thought of as like, when you think of farm policy, that's what a lot of people are going to think of, because that's the big federal agricultural farm policy affecting soil health. And all of that happens. And now you have today's modern farm policy and the Farm Bill. So what's in it? I have listed in here, there's 12 different titles, 12 different sections of the Farm Bill, and those are everything that's in it. I've highlighted some ones that where most people are going to typically think of where you see soil health policy in the Farm Bill. But really, you could look at any of these titles, and they all have an effect on soil health. Nutrition, for example, the food stamps program. There's the question of, can people using food stamps go buy from a farmer's market? And what impact does that have on farmers that have their business model as direct to consumer? And are those farmers ones that might have a more diversified model that follows better with one of the common principles of soil health, right, is to grow diverse crops? So yeah, just the question of all those dollars that are going into nutrition and how they're spent and what choices consumers have to spend those dollars, that can have an impact on soil health. So you can really, broaden what you think of as policy that is going to have an impact. I kind of broke this down. This graph is from National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition that shows how Farm Bill money is spent. Like the example I just gave you, nutrition, you can see what a big piece of the pie that is of actual Farm Bill spending compared to the other sections. The sections that commodities, conservation, and crop insurance, they have roughly similar amounts of spending, about 10 billion extra there for crop insurance. Those all affect soil health, and then you have that small little slice of the pie for research and everything else, all those other titles that are in the bill. And I can definitely send you guys these if you want to go look up all these links later. So an example of like conservation funding. So this is like the traditional, if farmers want to go enroll and get paid for a cost share practice to help cover some of their costs of doing a soil health practice, like cover crops or no-till or something else, you get that funded out of the conservation title. The largest programs there are the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, and then there's the Conservation Program, Conservation Reserve Program, the CRP, which is the traditional not planting land. So you're funded to not plant your land and to keep it protected. A couple of things that I've highlighted here are things from the last Farm Bill that related to soil health. That was in 2018. There was a new program, a new $10 million in funded for soil health demonstration trials, which are a combination of paying for farmers for practices and doing research on the soil health impacts of those practices. And there's been 2 rounds of funding for that program. Like one example is the FARMS program in Colorado, which is the Conservation Tillage Association out there. is funding farmers in Nebraska and Colorado and Kansas, I think, maybe another state, to do practices that are good for soil health, but also to measure and monitor the impacts of those practices, and then to mentor and do extension and share information with other farmers about their practices. So research, another big thing that has an impact on soil health is what research is being done on that, whether that's public or privately funded. There probably isn't as much research going on. It may seem like there is a lot going on soil health, but probably not as much research going on as there could be at land-grant universities. And that's increasing in recent years due to the attention that soil health is getting kind of in the news. So you see policy kind of follows the public mood, the politics, and what's popular at the moment. And there were some increases in soil health in the last Farm Bill for research. And then another big policy that impacts soil health is crop insurance. When you go back and you look at these pieces of the pie, the amount that's being spent on crop insurance and the amount spent on commodities, conservation, a lot of money is being spent on conservation to help increase the adoption of good soil health practices. And at the same time, you have money that might be counteracting any good adoption impacts of those practices. And crop insurance is one of those that we have to look at how it's being spent. Is it impacting soil health adoption in a way that might be counteracting the other money that we're spending on increased adoption? History kind of repeats itself. You know, we had all that prior to the Dust Bowl government encouragement of plowing up land that impacted what became the Dust Bowl. And over time, you know, that despite what happened then, history has repeated itself on a couple of occasions where farm policy with the best of intentions or created for the best of reasons maybe had an impact that had a negative effect on soil health. So crop insurance is one of those that we need to really examine and look at how it's impacting. So this, just if you don't understand how the program works, step one, the farmer pays the crop insurance program. That's the kind of buildings in the middle graph, pays the private insurer. The private insurer writes a policy just like they would to insure your car. And step three, the government pays about 62% of the farmer's premium cost of that policy. So the farmer pays the premium, but they're only paying on average about 40%. So not the full cost of what it actually costs to insure a crop. And insuring the crop includes losses that are due to weather, like bad rain, hail, a drought, and it also includes price-based coverage. So if the price drops significantly more than what it was expected to be when the farmer bought the policy, then there are policies that cover that. So that's partially subsidized. Then you have also the government is paying the private insurers the cost of their administration and fees to oversee the policy. So that's going to be different from other forms of private insurance. So there's a couple of different ways that the real cost of crop insurance is kind of masked in these policies. Step five, the farmer files a claim, has a loss on the crop. Let's say it's yield related. There was a bad drought that year and the farmer grew less corn and less soybeans than expected and files that claim. Then that is going to go back to the farmer in a payout on their claim. And normally what would happen is that underwriting risk in a private market would impact how that private funder pools together risk and how they charge for premiums on the next round of crop insurance. But because the government also subsidizes underwriting risk, what you have is that all the risk of that crop insurance policy, it all happens on the back end, and on the front end where you're paying the initial cost of the premium, the risk doesn't happen there. And what happens as a result is that the risk of crop insurance balloons, the cost that goes back in indemnities balloons, and then you have this kind of negative feedback loop. And I think the goal would be to move that risk to the front of the equation, to where that very first payment for the claim or for the policy or the front end risk is accounted for there, instead of being completely masked in those other steps along the way. And so there are a couple of ways that you can do this. One would be to maybe reduce those subsidies for the premiums and subsidies for the cost of the policy. Another would be, and that's, politically like almost untenable. Another way to make that happen, and things can change, people's moods can change and politics can change, so that might change along the way. But another way would be, if we know that soil health is probably going to reduce a farmer's risk of having bad loss due to drought, we could have that reflected in the initial price of the insurance. So if a farmer plants cover crops, for example, they don't have to pay as much on the front. So they're kind of paid for the cover crops by paying less in the front. And then at the end, maybe they don't need to file as large of a claim. So that's another idea for how you can change crop insurance policies. And there's other ideas too. So some other policy examples: state policies. There are crop insurance pilots doing just what I was just mentioning in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, where the state is actually paying part of the farmer's insurance bill if and only if they plant cover crops. The farmer can't collect the farmer can't collect double funding on acres. So if they're getting money for cover crops through some other program like EQIP or the other conservation programs, they can't also get the discount on those same acres. They can get it on other acres, however. So say you have a 1,000-acre farm and you have 400 acres of cover crops enrolled in one program, you could enroll another 200 or 300 or 400 or however much you want to in this other insurance pilot at the cost of $5 an acre. Some other examples are just straight up cost share programs that are paid by states instead of the federal government. And those really vary. A lot of states don't have a program at all. Iowa pays $25 an acre out of their water quality funding. Maryland, out of their Chesapeake Bay funding, pays up to $90 an acre for cover crops. California has a Healthy Soils Incentive Program that I think is mainly going to upfront costs and management, soil health management kind of training and research and funding. How do these practices impact soil health in the state? Of course, there's a lot of other soil health practices than cover crops, but I'm using that as a pretty good proxy of a practice that's incentivized by policy and how that affects adoption. So I've got two graphs. The first one is looking at the percent of adoption by acre in cropland acreage. So the highest state in the nation, Maryland, that has those up to $90 cost share incentives, has 29% of their acres in cover crops. And some of those other states that are high up there, they're also Chesapeake Bay funded states that have programs. The states on this list are, for the most part, smaller states with smaller cropland acreage. So I think that's a reason you don't see some of the largest farm states on this list, is they just have a lot farther to go on their cover crop acreage. When you look at the top 10 states by total acres of cover crops, it's a different list, because of course these states are bigger, have bigger acres and farmlands. And you see a few up there, Iowa and Indiana, that have invested in policies that really focus on either paying farmers directly for cover crops or putting a lot of money into training and education on cover crops, as in Indiana. And you'll also see on that list that since 2012, the percent acreage in cover crops increased for all of these states, some of them by more than 100%, so some of them more than doubled their numbers of acres. But still, the total percent of cropland acreage is a little bit low. So it stands to reason that if policy was changed to greatly invest in cover crops, we'd see those numbers change even more. Another example of policy, while I'm thinking about it, I just have the percent increase in acreage since 2012. So there's an example of a policy there. It's the Ag Census prior to 2012 didn't include a question that asked about the number of cover crop acres. So it was a matter of policy going to USDA into the census and asking for that question to get included. That's a policy action there. What we count, what we fund. There are a lot of different ways that we can impact through policy. And my presentation kind of ends there, but I was also going to go over some private sector examples of funding. So in the same state, Iowa, you also have Unilever is paying for a cost share. So private funding is going alongside with state funding. And paying for some cost share for farmers that are, that are growing soy to source their mayonnaise there. Kashi has an organic cost transition program where they cover part of the transition period. It takes a long time to transition land into organic. So they cover some of the farmers' costs and some of the farmers' risk to make that transition into organic agriculture. So there's a couple of examples of private. Corporate sustainability. That would be somewhere like Google or somebody else that is looking to improve their sustainability metrics and improve their carbon footprint might purchase offsets through a voluntary ecosystem service market. And they'll maybe pay for soil that way. And that's something that's a really hot topic in Washington right now. USDA is talking about a climate bank that would set USDA up as an arbiter to fund soil health practices and monitor soil carbon. And then private sector could operate through that model. That's a proposal. It's not something that's happened yet. So it's something that's developing. Just this week, the Growing Climate Solutions Act was introduced in the Senate, and that's it doesn't fund soil health, but what it does is it sets up a protocol for measuring and monitoring and for those private voluntary markets for soil health. At the same time, there is going to be reintroduction of the Climate Stewardship Act by Senator Booker, and that's a big bill that probably on its own won't pass because in Congress, you only have like the largest bills anymore that pass. So Farm Bill is one of those rare examples of something that isn't budget, that isn't like a big infrastructure, isn't a big stimulus payment that's actually gonna get enough votes to go all the way through both houses and to the president. So the Climate Stewardship Act by Senator Booker basically just sometimes doubles, triples, sometimes 10 times funds all those things in the conservation title that we were talking about before, EQIP, all those others, but it has a real focus on practices that are good for climate, so that are going to improve soil health in some way, like cover crops. The soil health demonstration trial that I mentioned from 2018, it ramps that up from 10 million to 100 million in funding. It reestablishes a civilian conservation corps and does other things like that would add jobs, research, extension to forestry, which, also you could say that there are some impacts there on how forest land is governed. So it's basically a massive funding bill. And so what happens in Congress is a lot of times is when they pass a budget bill, they'll take pieces of other bills that have ideas that are related to budget and they'll put that in there. and include it. So you might see something like Senator Booker's Climate Stewardship Act. You might see pieces of that act included in some other big thing like budget or stimulus. Another bill that's going to be reintroduced pretty soon is the Agricultural Resilience Act by Shelley Pingree. And that one was introduced in the previous Congress and is reintroduced. And that's another one that it might not pass on its own, but probably a lot of the things that are in it are prime candidates for what might be in the next farm bill in a couple of years. So if you look at that act, it has more funding for soil health, more reforms to crop insurance to reduce kind of risk through there, more funding for organic agriculture and for training on sustainable agricultural practices, and marketing assistance for producers. And all of these things impact soil health, even things that, again, might not seem to at first, like funding for marketing, because those types of things help someone that wants to do a more diversified crop rotation market their product or find a way to market that when a lot of infrastructure for diverse crop markets has disappeared. So a lot of little ideas like that are in her bill, and that's out now. And then probably what you'll see is pieces of that legislation that end up in later legislation. So those are a lot of different things that are going on in policy. I kind of started out in the past and fast forwarded to today and what's going on right now. All of these things, we can debate the merits and the effectiveness of each one, but I just wanted to kind of give you a broad overview.